Lena, welcome to This is Horror.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. And I mean, when both me and Bob read Mystery Lights, we were absolutely wowed. I think it is one of the standout short story collections from last year, not just within horror, but across all literature. So I definitely want to talk a lot about that. But before we get to the book itself, I want to know what were some early life lessons that you learned growing up in LA?
Early life lessons growing up in LA. Oh, that's a good question. I think growing up in Los Angeles, I always kind of had a, from when I was fairly young, like an awareness that I was in Los Angeles. And a lot of that was because LA is in a lot of films. So it was very strange to see like my home city in the movies I was watching. And I remember when I was about I think I was like in middle school, I did a short semester, even a semester. It was like 6 weeks at a boarding school in Toronto, and everyone was very impressed that I was from Los Angeles, and that was like very strange to me because I was very excited to be in a different city as a like young teenager. But then I kind of learned about like all the cliches about LA, and they were asking me if I'd seen celebrities, and that just all kind of came as a shock to me because I was like, whoa, I just thought I was from like the every town because that's what I see in these movies. But I think kind of bringing it back to my own writing, and I'm sure anyone could say this about where they're from, but it gave me like a real awareness of place, and I was always kind of curious about the city kind of growing up. I love to try to find like secret spots in the the hillsides, or have my little have my bus routes. I was really into like taking the bus places, and kind of getting out of the house. But yeah, I would say that it really gave me an awareness of kind of place, and of how and how cities work and how things differ by neighborhood. And But yeah, I really love Los Angeles, and I have a lot of it. A lot of the book is set in the desert, but a lot of there's a lot of LA in the book.
And do you think because you were surrounded by artists both within LA, and I understand your parents too were artists, your dad being a documentary filmmaker and your mother also a creative, did you know or did you feel drawn from an early age that you wanted to be a writer and you wanted to be a creative too, or was that something that came later?
That came pretty early on, yeah, and I am very incredibly grateful to my parents for being very supportive of my creativity from the time I was a kid, and my grandmother as well. I remember I'd write this poetry when I was in elementary school, and she printed out and put it on the bulletin board in her like community that she lived in. So it was very sweet. But yeah, my parents were always very supportive. They always took it like very seriously, and so that was really conducive to my growth as a writer, and also just seeing different paths that artists could take, and understanding that there also needed to be like some sort of day job involved. For a long time, my mother was like the breadwinner. She worked in graphic design, and well, while my father worked in on his movies, and like I think that's also a really important lesson for an artist to learn, is that the world isn't just gonna support you for your art. Like, you have to find a way to do it yourself.
Yeah, it's a kind of depressing but also liberating realization when you figure that one out. And I mean, the amount of writers that I talk to on This Is Horror, and it's not a full-time thing for a lot of people. It's something that they're doing between the cracks, even New York Times bestsellers. I mean, when we were speaking to Paul Tremblay for a long time, he's been a high school math teacher as well as a novelist, and that's kind of what you have to do. But I think too that each person's path is unique. So there is no set route to becoming a creative or a writer.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that is not necessarily reflected as much as it should be in kind of this, what people think of as the writing life. As much as I love Stephen King's book on writing, I think it has some incredible advice, and every writer should read it. There's this one part where he says, like, you should write for 8 hours a day. And you're just like, okay, Stephen King, yes, I absolutely should, but not going to work for me. um, so I do think that can kind of be a harsh reality when people realize that it's not it's not going to pay the bills. And in some ways, it's kind of nice to work outside of that, but also, artists should be supported for their work. Um, but yeah, it is definitely, it's always a struggle, finding time in those cracks, and it's been kind of a consistent struggle for me, kind of building a routine. Um, yeah, I'm amazed at any writer who can do it, and even more so when, like, writers have kids and a job, and are somehow churning out books. I'm just like, you are you are a superstar. Yeah.
So, I mean, talking about routine, what at the moment does your writing routine or your writing approach look like if it's a writing lack of routine?
Yeah, I will say, I loved publishing a book. It was, you know, really a truly wonderful experience. It really kind of shook up my writing routine and made it very hard to get back to the project I'm working on now. But when I am, and I'm kind of slowly kind of getting back there. But a lot of when I was writing Mystery Lights, I was lucky enough to you know be working at a writing space that was actually down the street from my office for my day job. So I'd usually go there in the mornings, maybe a few times a week, and then I work 4 days a week, so I was able to also go in there on Fridays, and kind of do longer stretches of writing. Um, and Yeah, usually in the morning is when I um, get a lot of work done. And then the other thing that has been, and that I really try to be consistent about, is doing some sort of writing retreat once a year, whether it's a writing residency, which are, they're competitive and it's hard to get into, and sometimes they can be expensive. But at the very least, getting, a rental somewhere, usually somewhere remote, for a week, for 2 weeks, and just being able to kind of un well, somewhat unplug, but like, just be by myself, and with my work. And if it's at an artist residency, somewhat in community with other artists, but also by myself as well, working. And that's when I am always surprised at how much work I get done. And that is when I do feel like I come close to the Stephen King ideal of being a writer who writes 8 hours a day. Is when I'm kind of on those retreats.
I mean, if you're on a retreat for 2 weeks, or you're kind of solo in isolation for 2 weeks. What volume of writing are we talking about? What might you get done in a typical retreat?
I usually I try to set a word count for myself. It kind of depends on what I'm working on. If I'm editing, that's a different story, but usually I'm working on more long form projects. So I usually set, I'm trying to remember what I set for myself. The last one I went on, I think it was I think it was around 2,000 words a day, something like that. Maybe it was more. I think it might have been around 2,000. And yeah, and having that goal really kind of helped me stay on track. The other thing I do is whenever I'm on these retreats in the morning, I will be I'm not super consistent about this at home, but I will keep a journal. Um, and uh, and that kind of gets things rolling. And the other thing I do, um, and this is a practice that I started kind of during COVID lockdown, is I have a like a collage practice. It's sort of a hobby, and so I'll do that kind of to wind down in the evenings, to keep myself from just streaming garbage television, which is fine, but not always conducive to staying in like the headspace that I'd like to be in when I'm working. So yeah, that's kind of my routine when I'm not living my day-to-day life on these lovely little escapes.
Yeah, and in terms of the journaling, it brings to mind Julia Cameron's morning pages to really kind of unlock that creativity and to just almost give you a clear palette for the process of writing that will follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't actually read Julia Cameron. A lot of students that I work with have found her work really, really helpful. So I've heard about it through them. Um, but yeah, it really is, and you feel like you've got something down, even if you're just kind of writing random reflections. And it can also be interesting to, I don't often go back to to those entries, but it can just be kind of interesting to go back and see what I was thinking about when I was working on this scene or something, or even if it's something from personal life that gets in there. But uh, yeah, I find it to be kind of um, just a nice way to wake up.
Yeah, I find anything we write down can be potential fodder for story ideas or story plots later, down the line. Sometimes there are things that we write and it's like absolutely that will not be going into a story, but it's good to have it to, as you say, even read back and to get back into that mindset. It might unlock something.
Yeah, 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 totally. I mean, the other thing I found useful for those kind of flashes of ideas, and I know a lot of other writers do this, but is the Notes app on my phone. I've started using that a lot actually. Um, just it's a great way to kind of I'm on public transportation a lot because I'm in Brooklyn, so it's much easier than pulling out my notebook and writing on a shaky subway. Just pulling out my phone. And I've tried, especially, in these past few months where I'm really making an effort to get back into this project that I'm working on and kind of move out of publicity mode. I really like anytime I get any sort of idea, I really make an effort to write it down because I can always just ignore it later. But usually I feel better. I feel like at least if even if it's 100 words, at least I've gotten something down for the day, and kind of kept in touch with my work.
And speaking of being in publicity mode, when you're in that mode, when you're in that mindset, is it possible for you also during the day to be doing writing, or do you have to kind of say, right, this day is dedicated to publicity, this one is writing? How does it work for you? Because I feel this is a dance, this is a balance that so many writers are trying to get right, because, of course, deep within us, within our soul, we just want to be writing. But it's also quite nice to sell books so you can write more books and get more deals. So, how are you navigating that?
Um, yeah, I think, this is my first time doing it. This is my debut book, so this was just kind of going off advice of other writers, and also you just kind of have to feel your way through it, I think. I, those, I think it was probably like July through, the book came out in August, so it was probably like July through October, November of 2024. I just told myself like don't don't worry about getting any significant writing done on this other project. And there was other, it's funny, as you probably know, when a book comes out, there's other writing that you have to do about the book. So like, I was pitching personal essays and doing interviews and those kinds of things and writing little, blog posts and, all opportunities I was very grateful for. But I think, as I was working on the book, I didn't expect to be like having to like, analyze these stories. I think I went in um, kind of thinking like, well, I wrote the stories, now people can read them and decide what they think. But that's not really how it works, which in some ways is is really great and fun. But it did get in the way of kind of creating new work. But I was also able to connect with a lot of readers and with other writers at at festivals, and was part of this. One thing that really helped with the publicity process is being a part of this cohort through Poets and Writers magazine of Britannicus, called Get the Word Out. And it was like a publicity incubator for debut writers who were publishing with independent presses. And we're still in touch on WhatsApp, and that community has been really wonderful because we were all kind of going into this situation, this crazy world of like publishing your first book together. And So that was really, having that community was really useful, like as a sounding board for, kind of like brass tacks, like industry questions, but also just emotional support, which it is an emotional thing putting a book into the world. So that was very helpful.
Oh, yeah, certainly. And I wonder, in terms of actually landing this with a publishing house, what did the querying process look like? Were you doing this with an agent? Was it solo querying? And how did you land with the two publishers that you ultimately did?
Um, yeah, so my process was somewhat unconventional. Um, I had, written the collection and was querying agents, and getting some really lovely responses from them. But a lot of the responses were like, these stories are great, come back to us when you have a novel manuscript because, you know, short stories are kind of a hard sell. And So I got a lot of those. I was querying for about a year. And after I kind of hit the 1 year mark, I was like, well, okay, I'm going to start sending this to contests, sending this manuscript to contests. And actually, I should say, in the process of this, I gotten some feedback from one agent on the manuscript, took those notes, revised some of the stories, um, sent them back, and did that agent did not end up taking me on as a client, but I did have this like they gave me very helpful notes. So I had like this kind of shiny revised manuscript, was sending it off to contests, and then it was actually kind of magical. I was in Utah on a hiking trip. Sorry. For my birthday, and I saw, looking at my phone, which I probably shouldn't have been doing and like this spectacular landscape I was in. But the Tin House was having an open call for short story collections that were grounded in place. And I told my husband, I was like, I have to do this. Like, we're going to have to put whatever activity we have on hold. I have to get this in. Luckily, I brought my laptop. So I sent it in, and yeah, and then they were interested, and and at that point, I still didn't have an agent, but once Tin House was interested, I was able to kind of secure an agent to help me with that. With that deal, and we're still working together, and it's been a really wonderful experience with Tin House. And then that the agent that I'm with, the agency that I'm with, was able to connect me with Dead Ink, who have also been really lovely. And I'm so grateful to both of these small presses because they're just so cool, and excited to be part of their roster. So yeah, that's kind of how it worked. A lot of times people start off with an agent and querying, and but I kind of went around it, got a did it a different way. So I think it's important to remember that there are many ways to get a book out into the world.
Yeah, I think there are just so many paths these days that there's not really a right way of doing it. But I love the serendipitous timing that Tin House had this call. It's like this is just perfect for you, and particularly with it being so much grounded in place, with it being grounded in the desert and the desert landscapes of America. I mean, there are a few stories that are in different locations, but there's this overall feel of that almost wilderness. And so, I mean, was this always a big thematic concern that a lot of these stories would take place in the desert, or did it kind of come together when you were looking at the stories that you had? When did place fit into this?
I think place, it was kind of it was almost a prompt for me. I'd actually written the title story first, and that was after a trip to West Texas and through West Texas, and I thought, well, what if I try doing a collection of stories that are, that feature kind of women in different desert landscapes. And that was a very like kind of very simple prompt, but it kind of helped the wheels in my head start to turn, and think about what the American Southwest kind of looked like in our imagination, what it was in reality, and what it symbolized. And that was that kind of guided me through the stories. They're all very places there. They're all very character driven. I would say, and but yeah, that definitely was kind of an organizing principle as I was working on these stories, and helped give it uh, give it a focus for me, both as I was writing and also as I was kind of trying to sell it as well.
And so, did you know early on that Mystery Lights was going to be the titular piece to the collection?
I did not. I think I was applying for a grant, and I think I called it Desert Women. Since I'd only written like, I think I'd only, when I was applying, I had maybe that story and a couple of other ones that may not have even been set in the desert. I was just like imagining the other ones I would be writing. So, yeah, so Mystery Lights did not, I don't think I decided that that would be the title story until I started kind of pulling the stories together and thought that that had kind of the most compelling title.
And in terms of the inspiration, you said you were on a road trip in Texas. Was there anything that kind of sparked off the story? I mean, obviously there are the real life mystery lights, but what was it that kind of drew you to this place and to creating the story?
Um, it was really the strangeness of Marfa. It was in a lot of ways, it felt like, and I will preface this by saying I only spent a couple of days there, so I don't want to, like, I'm not passing any judgment on it. It was a really wonderful experience, but it was just such an unusual little town because a lot of it seemed like it was kind of catering to this sort of outsider like me idea of what like a little desert town should look like. And then it also, so it had, there's like a, a motel that's been turned into this kind of boutique, hotel with like record players and in the rooms, and then it has also the element of this lore, right, of the mystery lights and this kind of this roadside attraction. Um, and there's also, this didn't make it into the story, but you drive a little bit outside of town, and there's a a border surveillance blimp for border patrol. So there's that kind of violence on the outskirts, and all in this, just this kind of beautiful open country, like big skies. I think the other thing we did is we went to there's an observatory where they open it up, once a month, and you can go look at stars through their telescopes, and that was really beautiful and really really great. So yeah, all of these things kind of came together, and that was the inspiration for that story.
And so, with the real life mystery lights, there are obviously various theories. Could they be orbs? Could they be aliens? Is there something supernatural going on? So, I want to know two things. Firstly, what's your take on what the mystery lights are? And secondly, what is the wildest theory that you've heard?
My take is, you know, this kind of goes along with my, kind of guiding thesis for the book, but I don't really have a take. I'm kind of agnostic, I did not personally see anything. I've spoken to people who have seen them. I spoke to one person writer who was like, "Oh yeah, I've seen them a couple of times." And so if you believe that you've seen them, then I believe you. I cannot say for certain what they are because I haven't seen them. I've seen like videos of them. I It was so long ago that I was doing research for the story that I actually can't remember what the most bizarre theory it was. I think the ghost. I have heard that they're ghosts, and that seems like a little bit of a stretch to me. But again, I don't know. Maybe I'm not one to put any of those down. Uh, or they could be drones for a viral marketing ploy. Like, I don't know. So yeah, I don't. I don't. I'm not an authority on that. So I don't know what they are.
And since you've posited the idea of ghosts, I mean, how does that fit in with your own beliefs in terms of the supernatural or lack thereof? And I understand, to jump forward to another story, that you may have experienced a ghost, which inspired clean hunters. So let's talk a little bit about your own beliefs and what did or didn't happen at that hotel.
Sure. Yeah. So my husband, my boyfriend at the time, we were we went to this inn in it was like rural Pennsylvania. I don't even remember how I found this place. And I was just kind of goofing off. We were, having drinks on the porch, and I looked up the name of the inn and then haunted and realized it had been I, on an episode of Ghost Hunters. Um, and so this may have put that thought in our heads. But there was a very rowdy crowd at the bar, and there was a hockey game going on. Um, and we we went to bed, and then I think uh, at some point in the middle of the night, or perhaps very early in the morning, we heard a knock at the door, and didn't see my husband didn't see any shadows, kind of, because you could see it's an old hotel, so there wasn't really anything between the door and the floor, really, so you could kind of see underneath, and he didn't see any shadow there because the light was on in the hallway. So who knows? um and we decided that whether it was a knock or by a human or ghost, we didn't want to spend another night there. Like, because I also don't want like a person from the bar trying to, or I don't, maybe it was a jiggling of the doorknob. I can't remember. I might be telling this wrong. Every time I tell the story, he'll remind me that I'm missing some important fact. But he's in the other room, so not here to correct me. But that's like the closest encounter I've had, besides a couple of times when I had some night terrors, which were actually much more frightening, but definitely were night terrors. And yeah, and I think it was that setting that inspired Clean Hunters. And it was also somewhat me being a little bit lazy. I started researching all the different tools that ghost hunters use, and I was like, I don't care about this stuff. So I'm just going to make them not use these. And Clean Hunters was born, and I found that it actually made for a more interesting story.
Yeah, well, I think as well with clean hunters, there's almost a dynamic as to what you will do to kind of be accepted. And so there's like much more like a kind of personal connection between the two protagonists within, um, that story.
Yeah, yeah, it's this idea that you really, you can never really know someone, and that's yeah, that was kind of what was driving that story, is that idea, what that would do to these two characters.
Yeah, I tend to find as well when talking about short stories, because they are short by their nature and we don't know who's read them when they're listening to this and who hasn't. We don't want to spoil, so we want to kind of thematically skirt around the edges to elicit interest, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. I hope I'm not spoiling them. But I don't think so. I
I
think that's
don't
just a
think so,
story.
no.
Yeah, it's about two ghost hunters who they don't use any electronic tools to do their ghost hunting. Um, and I think one of them has stopped seeing ghosts, and how it plays out is how the story goes.
Yeah, yeah, and I suppose when you had that knock at the door, would you want it to be a human? Would you want it to be a ghost? I don't know these days, because humans can do some pretty horrific things. You might prefer it to be a ghost.
It's true, and honestly, the ghost in that particular inn seemed like pretty cool. The woman she would like, I think she like played the fiddle at the bar and like would go hunting or something. I don't know. She seemed like a cool lady. So she seemed like she would be more of a benevolent ghost who might try to like mess with you a little bit, but wouldn't want to do any real harm. Whereas hockey fans, who knows?
There you go. And that kind of brings us to the opening story, Dogs, because the protagonist and screenwriter Ruth, she has a dilemma. Would she rather be chased by a pack of stray dogs, or would she rather get into the car of a man that she doesn't know? And kind of reminded me of this thing that has been doing the rounds, I guess, a few months ago. If you're a woman hiking in the woods alone, would you rather encounter a bear or a man? And I thought this is kind of riffing off that.
Yeah, yeah, that meme definitely came out long after I'd written the story, but it is, yeah, it's the same idea as you know this idea that uh these you can't really know what's going to happen when you're a woman who's alone, and I don't know that I'd want to encounter a man or a bear, I guess. But but yeah, that was what the story was playing with, and this idea of danger and kind of what you know the character perceives as dangerous versus what is actually dangerous. Um, and then on top of that, she's someone who's kind of built her career in creating these kind of harrowing situations for these female protagonists, and which is the nature of slasher movies, right? And Final Girls, and kind of putting that all together, and seeing what that would what having that background would do to someone were they to be in like kind of a real life situation of something that might happen in one of their creative imaginings.
Yeah, and I understand that you found yourself in a similar situation where you had to hitchhike because you were being chased by these stray dogs. So when did that happen? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, chased is a little bit of a strong term. I was on a writing retreat. I was in New Mexico, and I'd been working on I'd actually been working on a kind of intense scene, and was like, I just need to kind of clear my head. So I was already in this like kind of weird headspace. And so I went for a walk, and there was the property that I was staying on. There was this very sweet dog that would kind of like run around and take care of everyone. And then I guess once you left it, you were there were other dogs that were not as nice and sweet. So I was walking down, and I did these dogs started kind of coming after me and barking. And I, I think I wasn't far. I was probably like within 5 or 10 minutes from my rental, but I was not taking any chances. So when I saw an SUV drive up, I was like, I'm just gonna flag them down. It was a very nice couple, wherever they are. Thank you. Um, and but there was this one comment where like the driver was a man, said to me like, well, they probably wouldn't have done anything to you. And then his wife was like, you don't know that. And I was like that's dynamic. Like I can work with this. Like I didn't. It's true. I didn't know that, and they also probably might not have done anything. Like, but I just you don't know. It also made me feel very much like a city girl in that moment. But yeah, I remember just being absolutely terrified. I remember I write about that in the story, is like feeling my heart and my chest, and like realizing that there wasn't really anything I could like I didn't really know what to do in that situation except for kind of get into a car and be driven away. Um and but it ended up inspiring this story. So I wouldn't want it to happen again, but I guess I'm in some ways grateful that it did happen.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the more overtly horror stories in the collection. Although the tension and the horror, it's not in what happens, but in the possibility of what could happen, which I tend to find is even more terrifying. So there's just this thread of foreboding throughout and anxiety. This is very much anxiety horror.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a type of horror that I connect with, probably because I'm an anxious person. Um, but that was really intentional, and the story was kind of was building in that tension, and even kind of using like the shape of the hill, as kind of as like a guiding structural shape for the story, and using these this kind of external tension that she was having with her daughter, and just kind of having that all kind of mixed together. And it was really important for me that that tension, like I feel like in horror movies there's this odd thing that happens where sometimes when the scary part comes up, or in a slasher movie when like someone gets stabbed, there's like this release of tension because that horrible thing has actually happened. And with the story, I didn't want that to ever come. You're just kind of there suspended. um, and so in some ways it's uh, I guess there's a sense of relief that nothing happened, but you never get that, that sort of weird satisfaction that comes with um, watching someone get stabbed or something on screen in a horror movie. And I say, yeah, it's yeah, I will stand by that. There is a weird satisfaction.
I think, though, that because we don't quite get that resolution or we don't get the answers, it means that the possibility of something horrific happening continues off the page. So then it becomes a lingering horror. So I kind of like horror that doesn't answer everything because then it stays with you. If you've got the stabbing, for want of better phrasing, then okay, it's a closed loop. But what you have here is an open loop. You know, in some weird kind of Lynchian nightmare, maybe she is perpetually for infinity trapped within that car. We don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I love that kind of horror too. That doesn't have that leaves questions, and I think um, that is kind of a trope that you do see in horror movies. Some of it is for kind of more commercial reasons, like they want a sequel, but I think it also like lends to the to the story itself, is like you see like this evidence that like whatever evil is still lurking, and I think that that's like then you'll close the book, or you'll leave the theater, and it'll still kind of be living with you. And I think that's what I was going for with this story.
And I understand that from an early age you've been interested in and a fan of horror movies. So I'm wondering, what were some of the first horror movies that really captured your attention and imagination?
Oh, um, yeah, I was probably a little young. Watched a lot of horror movies. I think the first one that really kind of affected me was The Shining. And it was it, first of all, there was a kid in it. I think I watched it when I was probably a young teenager. And and that one was that really, I mean, that one really freaked me out. I think the one I that that like really scared me the most, and to this day I still kind of terrified to watch it, as The Exorcist. I remember watching that at a sleepover party, and just again, like the character was, I think she was actually around the same age that I was, and that was terrifying. And then as I got a little older, I started watching a lot of David Lynch, and he was, his films, and then eventually Twin Peaks, which I watched, when I was in college. Those uh, those really influenced my writing, especially kind of creating these off-kilter worlds, and I think they really influence a lot of the stories in Mystery Lights. This kind of, he's very good at building this kind of menace, and in situations that shouldn't necessarily be menacing, um, and working with nightmares like I've never seen anyone who can really quite match his ability to create a nightmare on screen.
Right, and I think it's apropos that we're talking about David Lynch now because the second story, You Can Never Be Too Sure, is arguably the most Lynchian story in the entire collection. And it takes place on a college campus. There is a predator on the campus, but there's also this folklore, this suggestion of the trapper and we're unsure. Are the trapper and predator the same? Are they distinct? Does the trapper even exist? There's something very Lynchian, and even the situation in which the protagonist finds herself in it. Yeah, it kind of reminded me of when I was in university and you kind of drank too much, you make bad decisions, you find yourself in a situation, but you only realize you shouldn't be there when it's too late. So, goodness, let's talk about that one. There's so much there.
Yeah, with that story, that was inspired by this. It actually, it's almost nothing to do with what actually happens in the story, but this college that was in kind of this remote part of Colorado, and I was told that that hunters would use the showers, and in the winter, because they would kind of, I guess, tramp through the college. This was a long time ago. I'm sure it's much safer now. But anyway, so that kind of got my head spinning, and thinking about that was what kind of built this, the lore, and from there I kind of got that voice, and the voice was very, um, that the voice kind of pulled me through the story. It was one of those that just the voice just kind of just came first, and uh, yeah, trying to think of what else I have to say about You Can Never Be Too Sure. Um, yeah, I think this idea that, sometimes these myths are created for a reason, and in this case, it was sort of as a warning. Um, and and yeah, I think that's that's what I have to say about that story.
Yeah, did you base any of it off kind of real life interactions on college campuses or, things that.
Um,
Mm,
yeah, I mean, I think my college roommate and we would sometimes, uh, I guess, spin out a little bit about, the fact, like, how easy it would be for someone to come onto campus and maybe come into a room. Um, and the reality, this wasn't, didn't happen to me personally, but the reality is sometimes those, predators are students at the school. Um, so I was again kind of thinking about these different types of horrors. Um, and uh, and yeah, again, this wasn't based on like personal experience, but it's something that is very common on college campuses, and that was what I was kind of responding to.
Yeah, there's something terrifying and it fosters immense distrust when you find out that statistically a lot of crimes that are committed, particularly violent crimes, are committed by people who actually know you or who are in closer proximity rather than it being a random stranger. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I should also add, I was working on this. It was shortly after actually my father was he made a film about sexual assault on college campuses. So that was also kind of in my mind as I was working on this. Yeah.
So, did your father or does your father make a lot of documentaries kind of grounded in, I suppose, what I might term real life horror and crime? Is that kind of what he's interested in or his speciality? And do you think that kind of influenced and informed your own preferences?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of his work has been kind of, I would say, with with survivors of you know sexual assault survivors that have been wronged by some kind of larger institution, and since so that was that was kind of, there were a few movies that um, that dealt with that, and then it kind of he moved into making more films about just more kind of big institutions screwing people over, be it like medical industry, etc. Um, I feel like it's kind of hard to draw a direct line between his work, because I also think like just being a woman in the world, like you also kind of encounter some of that horror also. But I would say, yeah, with You Can Never Be Too Sure, that was definitely kind of inspired by some of the work he was doing. Um, and but a lot of these are just from, unfortunately, from like having, you know, keep being alive.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of horror just through existence.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so, I mean, I'm wondering, since you said that you wrote this while your dad was working on this specific documentary, what is the oldest story within this collection, or the story that you kind of got the germ for the idea the longest time ago? I'm wondering what period these stories span in terms of oldest to most recent.
Yeah, so just to clarify, like, yeah, You Can Never Be Too Sure, I think that was written, it was it was probably a couple years after that the the film about the assault on college campuses called The Hunting Ground. It was probably a couple years after that came out that I wrote it. But I think the oldest story in the collection, um, I think it is, I think it's Clean Hunters. I think that's the oldest story in the collection. A handful of these stories, or maybe it was just about three of them, were from a previous collection that I've been working on but never got published. But I felt like some of the themes were similar to what I was working on with um, some of the desert stories and some of the newer stories. So I kind of I moved them over. Um, so I would say in all, these stories is probably like a 10-year period that I was working on them. Um, the newest one is actually the last story in the book, Vermillion. That one I wrote in the span of a couple of months. Um, my editor asked me if I had any other stories for the collection, and I was like, yeah, I do. And it was maybe a page of notes. So it was able to turn that into a whole story pretty quickly. But yeah, about a decade worth of work.
So your editor asked for another story. Were there any that were cut from the original submission?
Yeah, she didn't actually. I mean, I think she was just asking if there were any out there. But yeah, there was one story that didn't make it in. It was actually published in Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. It is called Blood Pool. I felt like the voice was a little similar actually to the voice and You Can Never Be Too Sure. And it was also kind of close to the voice in Bright Lights Big Deal. And I didn't want that voice to sort of overtake the collection. So my editor and I decided to pull that one out.
Right, and Bright Lights Big Deal is, of course, a very on the nose nod to Jay McInerney, and of course, the second person perspective that goes with that. And it's, of course, a story that is unabashedly New York. So, I mean, did you want to have, I suppose, as a nod towards where you are now, this very New York story within this desert collection, almost enclosed within a desert setting?
Yeah, when I was working on that one, I wasn't really thinking of it in terms of even fitting into the collection at all. Again, it was when I was kind of looking at the stories uh, as a whole that I was like, well, this does have some connection with some of these other stories in here. There's the kind of the sexual harassment, kind of violence against women, sort of subplot that happens, and then also these two women kind of in competition with each other. So I thought that kind of spoke to other stories in the collection in a way that, um, while it didn't share a setting and it doesn't really have like the same sort of supernatural horror elements that some of the other stories have, I thought it fit in. I would say it's definitely kind of an outlier, and I've had people, ask me, why is that there? There's nothing weird in that one. But I kind of I think it works.
I think it fits really well into the collection, particularly. I mean, when you're looking at the human horror of dogs, then you can never be too sure. I think it would be odd to say that Bright Lights Big Deal doesn't also fit in within that genre. And I mean, there's a line that's very chilling, and I'm going to completely butcher it. And it's when the protagonist is talking about, this awful thing that has happened to her friend, this sexual assault, this sexual predatory behavior. And then just some guy says, oh, I don't know if that's really a story. It happens all the time. And that is unfortunately the attitude held by a number of people.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think I had someone in my writing group call this story like pre-two because it takes place before Me Too. But sadly, I feel like we are like on the other side of it, and I sometimes wonder, I think there was a lot of progress made, but I feel like we're backsliding, so unfortunately. But yeah, that was a terrifying line to me as well, even though I came up with it.
Yeah, I can certainly see why there might be things that have happened recently that would lead people to think that we could be backsliding. But goodness, let's hope that things get back on track at some point. But it's, yeah, it's terrifying. It is terrifying.
Yeah, yeah, yes, agreed.
And I mean, in this particular story too, the protagonist almost has this dichotomy because she's desperate to make it, particularly before her parents' money runs out, that that she's got, that's facilitating her living in New York. But kind of her big opportunity is then to betray her best friend by selling this story, this private story that she was told in confidence. So there's a lot of moving pieces again in this one.
Yeah, yeah, I think this one is really, it's about being young and kind of learning how to be a human in the world. And I think that that's a time when, I mean, we always make mistakes, right? But I think that's a time when a lot of a lot of mistakes are made. And I wanted to show to kind of show that.
Now, in the notes for the collection, you mention that the print in Julia's apartment is Brooklyn Bridge by Georgia O'Keeffe. If we backtrack to the previous story, The White Place, this is also inspired. The painter is based on parts of Georgia O'Keeffe's life. So, I mean, how important is Georgia O'Keeffe to you? And is this where the story started, The White Place?
I was, I think I love I like Georgia O'Keeffe's work. And I think she's like a very important painter. I was really interested in kind of the myth of Georgia O'Keeffe, and kind of, I don't think I've ever been anywhere. I was in Abiquiu and in Santa Fe. I don't think I've ever been somewhere where like a woman painter has been like as admired, and just, she's just everywhere, which is it was kind of just incredible to me. And wonderful in some ways, but also like, it was, yeah, it was cool. Uh, so so that was kind of what I was looking at in the White Place. And that story actually started. It started with there was another voice that was in kind of the in contemporary times, and because the story's set in the 70s, and the orb was kind of the um, connective thread through these voices. And then I realized that I was just more interested in the characters in the 1970s timeline. So I cut that. But it started out as a contemporary story with the idea of George O'Keeffe kind of in the background, and then and but eventually that kind of fell away.
Yeah, and of course, another element that we haven't mentioned are the UFOs. And as we said before, I mean, there's a certain suggestion of UFOs in Mystery Lights too. So, is this an ongoing curiosity of yours? Do you personally believe in UFOs?
Again, I am kind of agnostic about them. I mean, yeah, there are things that are seen in the sky and people don't know what they are. So in that sense, yes. I was kind of the reason the UFOs, made it in is because they're often, a lot of them are seen in the desert, and that's kind of tied into to this, these myths, this lore that we have about the desert as a place. Um, and but I am not someone that, yeah, I'm again, I'm I'm like, if you believe what you want to believe. I don't I I do not know that much about UFOs, so I can't really speak to them. But I know people who've, claim to have seen them, so but who am I to say?
Yeah, I tend to find that my belief on both ghosts and the UFOs is almost similar to the X Files in that I want to believe. It's like I haven't seen something, but let's show me something. Not too violent, like just a relatively friendly ghost, like the one that you mentioned in the inn, who just plays music
Yeah.
and things. That a cool ghost.
Yeah, and I want to hear your stories about them, right? I love a ghost story. Tell me your UFO stories, tell me your ghost stories. Creep me out. Like that's what I love about this, the the supernatural and the unknown is the kind of the stories that they inspire.
I just think too that this possibility adds another dimension to life and to the world. It just makes the universe more exciting.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that was something that I think I kind of added in a later draft of Clean Hunters is this idea that, there's the idea that there's something beyond what we know. And I mean there is, right? Um but but yeah, I think like ghosts and UFOs are kind of a symbol of that, whether they are, you know, how they're portrayed in the various media that we consume, whether that's real or not, or or something entirely different. But yeah, again, like I feel like if you go to a party and ask people to tell you about a time that they saw a ghost, you're going to get some really interesting responses. And So in that way, it's like kind of brings people together in a funny way.
Now, you mentioned before that Vermillion was the latest story that you wrote. And I wonder if Vermillion and Trogloxene are companion pieces because, yeah, there's certainly the similarity in terms of missing people, albeit one of them returns from this bizarre cave system, although something has gone on when she returns. Is not quite the same. Are they meant to be companion pieces, or is it just thematically they have similar concerns?
They're kind of in the same universe, right? Because in Vermilion, the couple is listening to a podcast that is about what happened in Troglazine. So they are. It's like it's like the Mystery Lights universe, I guess. Um, I wrote Vermilion after I wrote Troglazine, and again, I thought that it was as I was conceiving of it, it was already kind of sharing that theme of kind of a lost girl, right? And and so I thought that it would make sense to kind of have them linked together. And there was a certain point as I was working on the stories where I considered making them linked, but it would have just been too imposing too much artificial structure onto them, and I don't think they would have held up to it. But those two I did decide to link. I love a linked collection, and I love those. It's almost like Easter eggs, um, and so I put it in.
Yeah, I think as soon as you realize, the podcast they're listening to is about the story you just read like four stories ago, you're like, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And I mean, I think that they're both, incredibly effective, but goodness, that with troglazine, it, it's just so disquieting. When somebody goes missing, usually when they're found, that's the relief, that's the end, that's the resolution. But in this situation, that's almost like the inciting incident. That's when the horror really steps up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That one was, yeah. I wanted to think about kind of what the aftermath would be. I mean, that was inspired by uh, that the cave rescue in Thailand, like very, very loosely inspired by it. And it was this one word that was used, which was quarantine, that the boys had to be put in quarantine, obviously, so they wouldn't, spread any illness. But at that time, this was pre-COVID. I was like, oh, quarantine, like what happened to them down there? And that was when my mind started moving to something more like science fiction. So that was kind of where how Troglodyne came to be.
Yeah, there's something post-COVID that has affected the kind of response to the word quarantine now. It shifted meaning, it shifted the image that it conjures up.
Definitely, yeah, it is much less science fiction now, much less fiction now. Uh, but that's what happens. Yeah.
Now, I know that we're coming up to the time that we have together today, but we haven't even mentioned the reclamation yet. And I know that we don't have enough time to really dive deep into it, but I mean, goodness, in terms of the satire on wellness culture, I wonder were there any particular incidents or cults or influences that you really drew upon? I mean, there's so many that you could have drawn upon, quite frankly.
Um, a lot of them, without naming names, since I don't want to get in trouble. Um, but for that one, it was this idea that really anyone can get drawn into these situations. I'm not saying anyone can, I won't spoil anything, but that story gets very violent, and I'm not saying that anyone is capable of that, but I think people are very open to persuasion, and we always think like, oh, well, that can never be me. Like, I'm not gullible, but if you're in the right place at the right time and someone's saying the right thing, I think we're all, that could be any of us. And I was interested in exploring that. And one book that I found useful as I was kind of revising that story, just in terms of thinking about like language, was this nonfiction book called Cultish by Amanda Montell. Um, and she kind of takes the same thesis that I had for the story, which is this idea that we are all kind of vulnerable to this sort of language, if it's the right person speaking to us and they're speaking the right way. And So I wanted to show what it would look like for one character to kind of be seduced by this charismatic leader, and then someone else to kind of fall away from that and start to realize that, like, oh, this is someone else who comes in a believer and then and kind of leaves as a skeptic, to kind of examine both sides of that. And also, I'd been listening to it was during COVID lockdown, I'd been listening to some self-help podcasts. And I don't want to, like, if self-help helps you, then please keep listening to it. But some of them I was just like, this language is so, like, asinine. Like, I can't. So that was kind of where the inspiration for the story came from. And, uh, and I think that a lot of times there are, bad actors that use language from, therapy and to try to kind of make money for themselves, and that's when you kind of have to watch out when they have some ulterior motive. So that's what I was looking at with that story, and I was also it's kind of structured. It's structured um, like a horror, kind of like a horror thriller. Things slowly get more and more weird and violent as the days go on at this retreat.
Yeah, I think this is definitely another one that has that Lynchian vibe, particularly the dynamic between the protagonist, Pat, who is getting deeper and deeper into this wellness cult, and then the skeptic, Celeste, and just watching, yeah, how they interact with one another. And as Pat goes deeper, the horror kind of amplifies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then once they get there's scene towards the end that's in the open desert, and that's when things get really crazy and weird. It was a fun part to write.
Crazy and weird to understate the situation somewhat, but
Yes, yeah, yeah.
pe-
Well, I don't want try not to spoil it.
yeah, yeah.
There's blood is spilled. Yeah.
Yeah, I think horror fans will not be disappointed with that one. So,
No, I think that's one of the few stories in the collection where like there's actually, it's not just about the idea of like impending horror. It's like the horror. It's there and it's pretty clear. So,
yeah, but I certainly think that this one will appeal to, horror fans throughout because, as we said at the start, just having this thread of tension, this thread of foreboding that permeates the collection, like there's always an unease. It's like if I find myself trapped in a Lena Valencia story, I'm going to want to get out. This is not this is not a good place to be. Stuff is gonna kick off.
yeah, yeah, it's funny as I was working on these and as I was, querying for the collection, I thought of them as, kind of genre bending, but I never really thought of it as as horror. And it wasn't really until I started getting such a like warm response from the horror community, which is wonderful. The community is really great that I kind of started seeing it as horror, and a lot of these are they are horror. So that's been a really kind of just great little treat in terms of putting a book out into the world. It's, you forget that um, readers are going to see it differently than you intended, and sometimes that's a nice thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like so much good fiction, Mystery Lights is something that can't really neatly be put into a genre box. I mean, yes, it is horror, it's also social commentary, it's literature, it's speculative fiction, it's all of these things. Sometimes people will try to have a binary, it's this or it's that, when it's both, it's everything.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to try to write just to, or at least for me, I don't like trying to write just to fit into a certain genre box. I feel like that kind of kills any creativity that I have. Um, So they're a little all over the place, but I like reading stuff that does that. So I hope people like reading my work too.
Yeah, I think the only thing we can really do to have creative satisfaction is to write something that is authentically us and that we want to write. And, if you try to write for a specific market, it can be a trap. I mean, not only is it likely to suck a lot of the joy out of what you're doing in the first place, but the irony is, if you start writing for the market, by the time you finish, that trend is gone. So you might as well just write the story that you want to write.
Yeah, that's really good advice, and that's something I try to convey, when I'm talking to writers who ask about that is, you don't know, if it's going to be werewolves or vampires next year. So if you like, zombies, write your zombie book, but write it in the way that you want to, write the zombie book you want to read, I guess.
Exactly. And the only story that we have yet to mention is the penultimate story, Reaper Ranch. And it's kind of apropos that we mention it because it's almost full circle because the dedication to the collection is to your grandmother. And I believe that this one was based on or kind of loosely inspired from your grandmother's real life diary that she gave to you after the passing of your grandfather.
Yeah, yeah. I found that she gave me a lot of her correspondence, and one of those was this kind of grief diary that she kept. where the entries were all addressed to him. And the story has nothing to do with my grandmother, except for that form, which I found like very compelling. So I kind of use that to write this sort of supernatural horror story through through diary entries, which is a form that was really it was challenging, and it was fun to work with. And Yeah, I think the real challenge with that, and this is something, I have a writing group and I showed it to them, was making sure that people believed the narrator, and didn't assume that she was just having had dementia or something, and really trying to kind of keep it grounded in that way. Um, but Yeah, and it was also it was about grief. I mean, that was the other thing I took out of the out of the diary, because it was a grief diary. Um, and Yeah.
And for those listening who might want to write a diary format or an epistolary story, do you have any advice in terms of what they could do to execute that most effectively, or equally some of the things that they might want to avoid?
Oh man, I'm working in that form right now, so I would like advice too. Uh, Let me think for a second on that one. Um, I think it's important to remember that while it is in the epistolary form, you are also writing a piece of fiction. So, if you're reading an actual diary, it might have, something like, today I went to the library and checked out this book. And in your fictional diary, you have to have something that's kind of going to work within the plot. And I think that's the biggest challenge. There's going to be this sort of this artifice, and it's kind of learning to kind of work with that, but still make it feel like a real diary. Um, but yeah, it's a hard form to write in, but there've been, two classic works of horror. Dracula and Frankenstein are both epistolary novels. So look at those, and you can learn everything you need to know. Don't listen to me. Yeah, that's my advice.
So, in terms of the future, you've said that you're working on a novel. You said that you're working on something epistolary now. So, does that mean that the novel that you're working on is an entire epistolary piece?
I don't know if it's going to be. It's still a little early days right now, even though I'm like, you know, a ways in. But I think that's going to be a large part of it. Will be in kind of these documents and letters. So that's what I've been working with right now.
Is there anything further that you can say about this novel? And the answer might be no.
It is going to be horror. Like it is a horror novel. But and there are monsters. That's all I can say.
Well, I think that's enough to pique the interest of everyone listening to this as horror. So, thank you so much for spending such a long time of your evening chatting to me today.
Thank you, Michael. This was really fun. I really appreciate you having me on the show, and highlighting Mystery Lights.
So, where can our listeners connect with you?
I am on Blue Sky, just my name, Lena Valencia, and then also same on Instagram, and then I have a website, which is again lenavalencia.com.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts to leave the listeners with?
Oh man, I don't know. Keep reading, keep writing. So how we get through the horror of reality. So that's all I got. Be kind to each other. I don't know. Yeah.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.